It's going. I can't get it louder. I mean, I can hear myself. Can you guys hear me back there? You sure your blood didn't go to your ears or anything? Anyways, I was reminded I'm not 25 anymore, so I'm kind of dragging. So I'm gonna need your. Yeah, I know. I'm gonna need your help tonight. All right, Mark chapter 3. Last week we talked about Mark chapter 3 kind of being bookmarked a little, or bookended a little bit when we look at kind of four major interactions that Jesus had. The two bookends, the front and the back, are kind of conflict oriented with the Jewish leaders, and in between, although inside those we still see this, in between we see these more kind of interactions that are more the traditional, compassionate Jesus. And I think we've talked about how Mark's very, very intentional. I was talking to Dave before class about later on in Mark, and how Mark's always, when you're reading through Mark, he's very intentional about using the languages and examples that he uses in his goal of helping his readers understand who is Jesus, who is Jesus, who is this Messiah. And so he's very intentional about the examples he uses and the language he uses, and we'll see that as we continue to go through the book. Last week we were talking specifically about the man with the withered hand who Jesus heals in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And if you remember from chapter 2, how we talked about one of the things that Mark is pointing out, among others, is that Jesus is pointing out very specifically that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And that's a very, very intentional and powerful message to the people who were going through it at the time, as well as later the readers of the gospel. And so I think we ended on this concept of how these people who are actually tasked with educating and being committed to and guarding God's law were actually the ones that totally missed God standing right among them. And we're going to see it again when Jesus deals with the casting out of the demons. But in that conversation, it was mentioned, and I said I would get to it, and I didn't get to it last week, that Mark mentions this alliance between the Pharisees and this group called the Herodians. Who were the Herodians? You know who the Herodians were? Well, the name is, what's the basis for the name Herodian? An Ian is somebody that is a follower, right?
Weren't they basically the Hellenized Jews that were kind of the political party of Herod?
Yeah, they were Jews. They were Hellenized Jews, which means they had incorporated a lot of Greek culture, Greek and Roman culture, into their life and practices. And so they were much more, at least from traditional Judaism, they would have been considered highly secularized. Mm-hmm. And the Herodians were actually, what would have their relationship with the Pharisees and the religious leaders have been? Were they friends?
Enemies.
Yeah, they were enemies. Well, we'll talk about that. Situationally, they could be friends, or they could be cooperative. I don't know if they were ever friends, but they certainly could cooperate. So the Herodians were actually followers of Herod Antipas. Herod was the ruler of Galilee and an area called, if I'm pronouncing it right, Perea, P-E-R-E-A. And we know him, he had a family dynasty. We know him as the Herod that executed John the Baptist. And so you're exactly right. He had this political following. But typically, the Herodians and the Pharisees would not have been working cooperatively. They would not. They weren't friendly to one another. They were at odds with one another. But regardless of the fact that they were natural enemies, what were they doing in this case? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, exactly. So they're natural enemies. the Pharisees actually resented the Herodians because they were firmly entrenched with the Roman political world. They were inside and part of the Roman political world. They actually backed Roman rule. The Herodians supported the rule of Rome over Judea, Galilee. But it's interesting, what united them? Well, the opposition to Jesus, for sure, right? Now, they would have been opposing him for different reasons, right? The Pharisees would have been opposing him for what reason? Yeah, religious. I mean, he's there. I mean, I think they're figuring out who he's claiming to be, right? So he's threatening their rule and authority. Why would the Herodians have objected to him? Or same thing, only from a political perspective. Like, here's this man that's come, king of the Jews. People are looking at him as, and people were wanting him to be a political leader, right? I mean, we're still early in his ministry, and so as people are perceiving him as a potential political leader that is going to help the Jews rise up and rebel against Rome. So you have this opposition to Christ that unites these people who actually agree on almost nothing else. Almost nothing else. What does that? Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, oh wow, this is really loud. You also have to, one of the things that unites them is actually fear. Fear. Because they both want to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
That is actually the Pharisees, despite by mouth or by word, opposing many of the things of the Herodians, the political beliefs and things like that, they were morally compromised because they knew that if what Jesus was saying was true, that would upend the entire social order, that they would suffer the consequences of Rome coming in, because they were supposed to be essentially the de facto, to suppress the population's revolutionary tendencies,
well,
right?
Do you remember we talked about that one of the things that was unique to this area that Herod had rule over was it had a level of political autonomy that wasn't true of all Roman provinces. Yes. And so they had an unusual amount of political influence and political power. So you're exactly right. I think fear, it's interesting, fear will often unite. Well, is this a foreshadowing? I think the early chapters of Mark have a lot of foreshadowing in them. When you look up to the culmination with the crucifixion, what I find interesting about this is Jesus has the ability to unite anybody.
Even his enemies.
Even his enemies, right? Now, not necessarily to unite with him, but to unite, right? You're exactly right. They both saw him as a threat. And he's a threat to their interests, their authority, their stability, whether it's political or religious. In all of those cases, he was a threat. But I think you look at the foreshadowing of the coalition that ultimately crucifies Jesus. It's a very similar coalition that does that. All right, let's move on. We read it last week because I read, I think, through 20, but let's pick back up in verse 7. We're going to read 7 through 12. Oh, there, okay. Mark chapter 3, 7 through 12. Now, we've got this interaction in the synagogue, and so now we're changing. It says, but Jesus withdrew himself with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and from beyond Jordan, and they about Tyre and Sidon. A great multitude, when they had heard what great things he did, came unto him. And he spake to his disciples that a small ship should wait on him because of the multitude, lest they should throng him. For he had healed many, insomuch that they pressed upon him for to touch him, as many as had plagues. And unclean spirits, when they saw him, fell down before him and cried, saying, Thou art the Son of God. and he straightly charged them that they should not make him known. All right, so I think Jesus knows there's already now this beginning of this plotting against his life, right? And so for whatever reason, that's probably among them, he withdraws with his disciples toward the sea. What's the sea? Sea of Galilee, right? And what we see here, and again, this goes back to, I think, Mark's intentionality. Mark could have just said, and a bunch of people followed him. But he actually mentions Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, all these places, right, beyond the Jordan, even as far as Tyre and Sidon. Why would he mention all of those places? Adds validity. Okay, what else? Yeah, if we can, we want to use the mic. If you have more than a sentence, use the mic. Are we live streaming, Dustin? Are we live streaming or just taping? Or just audio live streaming? Okay. What else? Why mention all these places?
Well, if I remember correctly, Tyre and Sidon actually is the area.
If I remember correctly, isn't Tyre and Sidon the area from which the Herodian family came?
I don't know the answer to that.
Or maybe it was Syria, I forget.
Yeah, I don't know.
But that's going to be more of a secular area. So.
Yeah. So the places mentioned, Suze, you want to get? Look, can you wait for the mic for me? Thank you. You're really hard to hear.
I feel like I'm not. I was just going to say I'm just telling you the effect it had on me, giving all these different places. Because it's one thing to say many, many, many people came, but when you're seeing how far apart they are, and they knew they were living there, and all over the place. So I think that, and that me hearing so many names, and then he says beyond the Jordan,
right?
That really did help me to get the picture.
I actually think that is one of the reasons he does it. There are others. One of the reasons he does it is to be, they were walking where they went. So for some of these people, this was not a small travel. This was a significant commitment to come and find Jesus. And the reason, that they say two reasons. One is they had heard about all the great things he was doing, and a lot of people were sick. A lot of people were coming to be healed. Let's go back to the foreshadowing concept, though, that we talked about just a few minutes ago. What would have been the cultural makeup of most of these places? It would have been primarily Gentile. These would have been highly Gentile communities. Now, there would have been synagogues, there would have been Jews in all these communities. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I actually think this is another of those foreshadowings of how Jesus is reaching out way beyond Judaism. This is the foreshadowing that Jesus is taking who he is to the Gentiles. And remember, Mark is telling us who Jesus is. And he's telling us who Jesus is revealing himself to, and I believe why. And so early in his ministry, we already have Jesus reaching out and hitting a community that would not have been typically, nobody in the Jewish community would have thought that. They would not have anticipated that when the Messiah came, that he would be reaching out to the Gentiles at all. And yet, it's a highly Gentile audience that is immediately, and I think it's so interesting. You have all these people that are just driven to find out who Jesus is, even when they haven't seen him yet. They've only heard about what he's done, right? Word of mouth. This isn't like they read the newspaper. It's word of mouth. And you have these religious leaders who are standing there watching him do it and missing every single part of it. Not only missing it, but using it as rationalization to plot against him. Rob?
Sorry, I haven't been here because I've been teaching the teens class. Has he been to all these places yet?
No.
Okay.
I don't believe
so. I just think that's interesting.
Yeah.
To go back to the original question, is that people from places he's never even been to yet or found, which I think you were getting at.
Yeah.